And so, Sarah, thank you very much for joining us from LA today. I know it's a balmy afternoon out there. I'm not going to sit here and do idle chit chat. Everybody came to listen to you, so I'm just going to pass the torch and let you roll with it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Michael, and for inviting me tonight. And thank you all for coming. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces. So I am going to go ahead and share screen, and we hope this is all going to work the way it did. And we were trying it out. Okay, do you just see my name? Anybody?
Yes, I just see your name.
Good, good. I just want to make sure. Okay. I love that you list these talks, Michael, about artist life, work, and passions. I really thought about that and what passions I wanted to share with you today. At the end, I'm happy to answer any questions about my life and process, and also about anything else. We're all friends here, so any question about you want to ask me. A lot of you know me from other parts of my life and from things I've done, so I'm happy to answer about anything. And then we're going to hope this is going to work to the next slide. Good. I'm going to take you on a journey of memory and how my childhood and the place I lived have shaped me artistically. But memory is a finicky thing. It pulls and pushes us in unexpected ways and shows up in my work even when I'm not expecting it. I know that all photographs are really self-portraits, as they are a reflection of our inner and outer world. Up until my teens, I thought I was going to be a writer, as I loved making up stories and writing poetry. And so it makes sense that I found a way to create narrative work. I make photographs that speak to emotions and don't always give away the whole story, as I want the viewer to imagine the ending. My work revolves around themes of home, female identity, memory, and the subconscious. I took a class with Keith Carter in about 2002, and he gave a spin on the old saying for writers and told us to shoot what we know. It was great advice, and I learned that this is where the truest projects come from. So here is a photo of me, age 2, in St. Mark's Square in Venice, Italy, with my father and brother. My parents met in Milan in the early 60s, and we always had a connection to Italy and to Venice in particular because of my father's job. Venice has remained one of my great loves, and it will soon be apparent why. I was born in Boston, and when I was 4 years old, my life took a very unusual turn. My father was named the director of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which you see here, and we moved into the apartment on the 4th floor, which had been built as Mrs. Gardner's private residence. After Mrs. Gardner died in 1924, the subsequent directors and their families all lived above the museum in her apartment. But after we left, the trustees decided to turn it into offices, so we were the last family to live there. For those who don't know, the museum was built by a wealthy heiress, Isabella Stewart Gardner, pictured here. She was born in New York in 1840 to a wealthy New York family and married one of the most eligible bachelors in Boston, Jack Gardner, in 1860. She built the museum around the turn of the last century to house the incredible collection of fine art which she and her husband had amassed, and which included works by Vermeer, Rembrandt, Raphael, and Titian. They also collected Greek and Roman statues, medieval tapestries, Asian art, and many artifacts from their travels around the world. I think Isabella found Boston society a little stifling, as she was from New York, and she was also very outgoing and eccentric. And I believe that is why she became friends with so many artists and writers. Of course, she was a patron of the arts too, but I think she found them a little more interesting and a little less proper than her Boston peers. The more I've discovered about her, the more impressed I am with her, and we will talk more about the influence she had on me. Mrs. Gardner built the museum around a courtyard, which she made to look like a Venetian palazzo by using actual balconies, railings, arches, and columns, which she brought over from Venice. She wanted to create a European palace that would allow others to share her love of art, music, and flowers. The apartment she built for herself surrounds the courtyard, and you can see the 4th floor windows in this photo behind which we lived. One of the most remarkable things is that she named the museum after herself, though she and her husband had planned it together, but he died before it was built, and she called it the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, a bold move for a woman who didn't even have the right to vote when the museum opened in 1903. This is the way you would enter the museum in Isabella's day. The photos from 1904, shortly after the museum opened. The courtyard was always full of flowers, which made it an oasis of green and life, even on a wintry Boston day. Now there is a new wing built by Renzo Piano, so you enter the museum on the left-hand side of this picture. I've been collecting these old photos which are by a man named Thomas Marr, who was a photographer for the wealthy, and spending time in the archives at the Gardner as I'm working on a project about growing up there, which I'll show you a little bit at the end. I'm going to walk you through a bit of the museum, as it's hard to grasp how unusual it is without being there. Each of the rooms in the museum is like a giant cabinet of curiosities with paintings, sculptures, furniture, special wall coverings, tiles, and more. Mrs. Gardner decided the placement of everything you see here and wrote in her will that nothing should be moved or changed. So it has remained virtually the same for more than a century. This is the Dutch room, and that is a self-portrait of Rembrandt to the right of the door. As you can see, she collected the paintings, the furniture, the wall coverings, the floor tiles, that beautiful doorway made of wood, and the sculpture above it. Each room is an amalgam of objects from different countries and different centuries brought together in one space with the light and shadow playing on them. These are all things that I subconsciously have internalized and which you will see cropping up in my work later. This is a desk in the Dutch room filled with small treasures, a silver lion, a bell, a fan, a copy of Dante, all beautifully arranged on this wooden inlaid desk. Above the desk was Vermeer's The Concert painting, which was stolen in 1992. And because her will said that nothing could move or change, the frame stands empty and black, a reminder and a hope that it will return someday. This is the Petit Salon, which was meant to evoke a French salon around the turn of the 18th century, complete with a tea set, snuff boxes, a harp, and elegant tapestries. I loved this room as a child as it seemed like a fairy tale setting. Mrs. Gardner was friends with many of the artists whose work you see on display in the museum, and she also collected many cases of photographs, autographs, letters. The cases also contain instruments, plaster hands, a death mask, playbills, and other ephemera. These have had a large influence on my latest body of work, in which I'm creating tableaus with my own archival material and from that of my time in the museum. This was the view from our apartment. We lived in the museum from when I was 4 until I was 22, and it was a vast space that felt both magical and mysterious. There was a hallway that ran all the way around the apartment and faced onto the courtyard. Often I saw visitors look quizzically up at me, and I stared back at them. I didn't have any particular reverence for significant works in the collection. I was mostly fascinated by the statues and paintings of lions, dragons, and other creatures, and the works pertaining to Greek myths, which I'd read about. You have to imagine a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old running around this incredible space. It seems strange even to me now that we lived there for almost 20 years, but it also felt somewhat normal. My sense of private and public space was blurred, as well as the idea of nature and architecture being combined in a domestic setting. It was an extraordinary place to grow up, there is no doubt. I was surrounded by art and sculpture, and it gave me a deep knowledge of art and history, as well as an understanding of religious iconography and mythology. But the museum was also somewhat dark and creepy, and that has found its way into my work as well. There were strange religious and mythological scenes, as well as statues with missing limbs and heads, and a Medusa with her head of snakes at the center of the Roman mosaic in the courtyard. And though the courtyard is glassed over and there is sunshine that pours into it, the interior rooms are not well lit, and Boston can be overcast for a lot of the year. So the Gardner Museum is relatively dark, and visitors often complain that the pictures are hard to see. I remember there were long, dark hallways and lots of heavy Gothic furniture, sculptures, tapestries, candelabras, and a general eeriness about the place. I was a voracious reader as a child and could relate to stories of kids living in old dilapidated castles or abandoned houses and solving mysteries. Stories like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, as that is what my own life felt like. There were plenty of little known corners, passageways, hidden doors, spy holes, and other fairy tale-like things to stimulate my imagination. And I'm convinced the surreal and sometimes dark and shadowy nature of my work comes directly from growing up in this environment. I remember the museum mostly in the afternoons, late afternoons or evenings, as I was at school during the day. Each night I would go to bed seeing the lights on in the courtyard and hearing the footsteps of the guards as they walked their rounds down the attic passageway above my head. And I heard stories of people seeing Mrs. Gardner's ghost, and there were enough strange sounds to make me believe that the museum could be haunted. Upstairs in our apartment, only a few of the rooms were as Mrs. Gardner had left them. The dining room was one of them. This is a photo from the New York Times taken when we lived there, which I actually found on eBay. This was Mrs. Gardner's dining room table and chairs as well. Since it was the 70s, my parents didn't take many pictures of us in the museum or in our apartment. And so sadly, there are only a few images of the apartment upstairs, as it wasn't considered part of the museum. Here's a birthday party with me at the head of the table. And this is what that dining room looks like today. You can see the paneled ceiling in this photo, the chandelier, which I believe is supposed to be a gold upside down ginkgo leaf, and the fireplace with wooden soldiers and the terror round with the Virgin Mary and Child. The wallpaper was actually made from the inside of Chinese tea boxes that Mrs. Gardner just liked. In this photo, you can also see the hallway, which ran down around the courtyard, and my bedroom was at the far end. My room used to be a sewing room and was relatively small and plain, and I decorated it with posters like a normal kid. Today, it is someone's office. At the other end of the apartment was a study, which was also somewhat the way Mrs. Gardner had left it. It had one of the only working fireplaces in the apartment, and we used it on cold nights. The others were sealed up because there were bats in the attic who would come down the chimneys at night. This room had wooden panels around it, and I remember spending an afternoon with my best friend knocking on all the panels and hoping that one of them would open to reveal a secret passageway. My father also owned a complete set of first editions of Sherlock Holmes, which he kept in this room and read to us occasionally. Many people have likened my childhood to Eloise, who grew up at the Park Plaza Hotel and who was sort of an incorrigible child. But the book that I felt was the closest to my experience was The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, which follows two kids who run away from home and live at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York for a week and solve a mystery about Michelangelo. Since the courtyard was off limits for playing, we spent a lot of time in the gardens, which also contained statues, wells, and some sarcophaguses. This is an old view of the garden, which I found in the archives, and it shows the annex to the museum, which is where the offices were when we lived there, and which was later removed along with these gardens to make space for the new wing. There was a place I called the Secret Garden, as it was behind an old carriage house. You can sort of see the museum off to the left, and the little balconies were off our apartment. It wasn't really secret, but visitors were not allowed in this garden, and the staff hardly went in it. There was a big fountain, which is covered in this photo, and a rose trellis when we lived there, and this incredible doorway, which I never saw open, but which was built as a stable door, even though Mrs. Gardner didn't have horses. This building and the gardens were all leveled to make room for the new wing. So all of the gardens that I played in as a child are now gone. The reason I'm showing these pictures of the garden, which I found in the archives, is that I realized the overgrown and almost menacing nature of the trees and ivy have found their way into my storyline series, which you will see in a little bit, and how this idea of hiding in nature also crops up more than once. I was given an Instamatic camera probably when I was 8 or 9, which shot 110 film. For those of you who don't know, it's very, very tiny film. And I took this photo of my brother, James, in the gardens. It's interesting how that camera created the same dreamy and ethereal effect that I would later embrace. As I said, Mrs. Gardner has played a huge role in my life. I was aware that I lived in her house and that we had some of her furniture in her apartment, but it was more that she was a constant presence in my life. She was renowned in Boston for her strength as well as her eccentricities, like arranging for boxers to come to her house and fight, as women were not allowed ringside. She was also very charismatic, and people of all ages were drawn to her. She was highly intelligent, and though she didn't attend college, she joined the Dante Society run at Harvard and read the classics and learned art history through reading and looking at paintings and sculptures in museums around the world. I've been doing research on her for the past few years, as she lived at a time when women didn't run businesses, and it is extraordinary that she created this museum based solely on her vision and a determination to have it come to life. Mrs. Gardner spent a lot of time in Venice, not only built her museum as a palazzo, but also displayed many paintings of that city, as well as furniture, lace, and other things she had purchased there. This is a watercolor by John Singer Sargent in the museum. I studied art history in college, but decided to take a semester off my junior year. And my father suggested that I apply to work as an intern at the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice. This is the unfinished palazzo that Peggy Guggenheim lived in and which was turned into a museum when she died to house her extraordinary contemporary art collection. And here is Peggy Guggenheim in her motorboat with her dogs in Venice. I do find it ironic that I worked in Venice in a house museum, which was founded by another eccentric and strong female collector. I think there's some kismet in that. And after college, I went back twice and worked at the Venice Biennale and in the American Pavilion. And it was in Venice where I started to take pictures and think about being a photographer. Here's an early black and white photograph of mine. And that time in Venice was really a turning point for me, as I was surrounded by art and artists from all over the world. And my father came to visit me several times, as Venice was one of his favorite places too. Shortly after I graduated from college, my father decided to take early retirement and after more than 20 years as director of the Gardner. And as a result, we had to move out of our apartment on the 4th floor. At the time, I was more focused on finding a job and figuring out where my life was headed. And to be honest, I hadn't lived at home in a couple of years. And like so many things in life, I just didn't realize that when we moved out, I would not set foot in that apartment for 20 years. Eventually, I got a job at the National Gallery of Art in DC. And about a year later, I got a call one morning and learned that my father had died of a heart attack in his sleep, and I was devastated. I had already left Boston at this point, but shortly after I moved to Chicago, and so no longer had ties to Venice and the museum. But after he died, I made the decision that I wanted to be a photographer, and so I quit my job and went back to school to study photography and hone my craft. I moved to California for the first time and started taking classes in photography. I'd always loved old cameras, so I bought a Rolleicord and began shooting with it. I eventually found my way to art school at the Corcoran College of Art in DC and started my career as a photojournalist working for newspapers in Virginia. This gave me an excellent foundation of how to tell stories through pictures. Within a few years, I moved to Chicago, where I continued working as a photojournalist and in museums. One of the first projects I worked on that had to do with memory and my childhood was called the Three Arts Club. Up until then, my projects were very outward facing, as I was a photojournalist and a street photographer. And I'm just going to show you a few images from this project, as it was never fully realized. The Three Arts Club was built in 1912 and provided residential spaces for women artists in Chicago until 2004. There are 2 other clubs, one in Paris and one in New York, hence the name The Three Arts. I went to an exhibition at the club and was enthralled with the place. The residents had recently left and it was actually falling into disrepair, and they were trying to raise the millions needed to restore it. I knew the director there, so I asked her if I could come and make pictures in the building, and she agreed. Once again, I was in an institution that had been a residence. I spent long days there in solitude, and it was the start of me addressing the loss surrounding my father's death and my childhood home. It was creepy, and I was alone and trying to create pictures that spoke to my own inner turmoil. And I was starting to address themes of impermanence and memory. So many things there reminded me of the Gardner, the fact that it was built around the same time period and situated around a courtyard, and the artists had lived there. It also had clawfoot bathtubs, old radiators, and more. And I started searching for signs and symbols and trying to take pictures that asked questions. I began to include myself in the photos to become the character and the witness to this beautiful and forgotten place. I read not long ago that Mrs. Gardner put mirrors in almost every room in the museum. And of course, we had dozens of windows into the courtyard. So this way of seeing forward and backward has always fascinated me as a way of talking about time, memory, in the past. I was still developing my style and wish I had shown these pictures to someone or talked to a curator or a mentor about them. I didn't know the work of Francesca Woodman, but have later come to love it and wish I had used them as a springboard for the project. But it was a good transition for me from being a photojournalist and a street photographer to working on projects that were more personal and had deeper meaning. The building was closed shortly after I took these pictures, and it's since been renovated and turned into a beautiful restoration hardware with a cafe in the courtyard, so you can go visit it. The next project that was inspired by my life at the Gardner was a project about a place called Ragdale, which is an artist and writers retreat in Illinois. I'm just going to show a few images of this project as well. Ragdale was built around the turn of the century by an architect, Howard Van Doren Shaw, who used it as the summer house for his family. And later his granddaughter, Alice Hayes, made it into an artist retreat. It was designed in the arts and crafts style, and Shaw made much of the furniture and designed elements in the house, including this front door knocker. I was first accepted to be a resident, and I felt incredibly young and green as I sat at the dinner table among accomplished writers, musicians, and artists. One of them told me she'd been working on a project for 10 years and finally had it published. And I thought, 10 years, oh my gosh. Little did I know that my project about Venice would take that long. Once again, there were many things about this house that reminded me of the Gardner, and as it was also built around the turn of the century and inhabited by a family of artists and writers. During that stay at Ragdale, I met the director, Susan Tillett. She liked my photographs and invited me to make images for a book about Ragdale that she was writing. The light at Ragdale was magnificent as it sits on acres of unspoiled prairie land, and Shaw built many windows facing the prairie, so the sunset comes through in the evenings and casts this brilliant orange light. This table reminded me of our dining room table, and I started unconsciously photographing childhood memories. There was plenty of art on the walls and beautiful wall coverings, as well as mythological creatures and drawings like this lion. And Shaw was a romantic and a lover of nature. So the natural world was brought inside, as evidenced by this wallpaper. And there was a sense of timelessness about Ragdale and a real beauty in the furniture, colors, and light, which spoke to me as well. And my pictures became an investigation of home and domesticity in another institution. I was able to go back and stay at Ragdale 5 or 6 times at different points of the year. And I met amazing artists and writers and had incredible conversations over the dinner table, which also helped me greatly on my journey as an artist. The artist retreat still exists, and it's a wonderful place to go for anyone looking for time and space and looking to delve deeper into a project. The book, The Ragdale House Speaks, was published in 2012. And I'm so grateful for the time I got to spend there with so many accomplished writers and artists who taught me so much. It was around this time I decided I really needed a mentor. So I Googled Chicago photographers and came across the beautiful work of Jane Fulton Alt and wrote her an email asking if I could work with her. We met, and it turned out that ironically, her husband's sister had been the first curator at the Gardner Museum while we were there, and I had known her. Jane was starting a critique group, and I joined, and she was the one who really taught me how to shoot from my heart and not my head. Shortly after my first stay at Ragdale, I headed to Venice with just a camera and a desire to make a project about a place that had been so influential in my life. It was a place I knew and loved, but when I started Lost Venice, I knew I did not want to shoot cliched views of gondolas and canals. I knew I wanted to be a personal project, and eventually that is what emerged, a story about the loss of my father, about the loss of Venice as I knew it, and the loss of my childhood home. And it was during that first trip I saw this man who looked so much like my father, I thought it was a ghost. He was walking over this bridge into the mist, and I followed him, and that image became the seed of the project, as it focused the direction of the series into a quest to reconnect with my father and my past. I traveled to outlying islands and abandoned corners of the city and found dark and mysterious passageways and followed people like Sophie Calle did. I photographed mostly in winter when there were fewer tourists and it was foggier and more melancholy. I wanted the viewer to feel a sense of longing and mystery. And Venice is an extraordinary place because it is a timeless city. And I wanted to transport the viewer back to an earlier Venice, which is why I chose to sepia tone the images. I wanted the viewer to get lost in the images and also to feel a bit disoriented and off balance. And nature, of course, is a constant in Venice, as the ocean and the tide are an integral part of life. And the salt water is eroding Venice's foundations. So the city is in constant decay, and impermanence is a big theme. These windows were reminiscent of the gardener, but I felt the awnings were a metaphor for life and death. And here you are taken across the river by an anonymous boatman, just like in the Greek myth when Charon rows you across the river Styx to Hades. And here's an angel with moss covering her eyes so she can't see. Lost Venice is a story about my own personal loss, but loss and change are universal themes. And I'm very grateful for this experience and my time there. It did take me 10 years to finish the project, but it was an enjoyable 10 years, and I worked on other projects as well. This is the handmade book I made of this project initially. And then I found a designer, and Lost Venice was published in 2020 by Damiani. Since time is a bit fluid in my art, I would like to back up to when I first went to art school. I think it was in my second year there, a teacher asked me if I was afraid of taking photos of people, which I was to some degree. So I began shooting on the street, which is a great practice that I still do to this day, and which helped me in Lost Venice as well. This is the Rolleicord I bought right before I started the Corcoran, and it was great for street shooting, as having a waist-high viewfinder meant people rarely knew I was taking their photos. I'm at the Chelsea Flea Market in New York here in the mid-90s. I've always loved antiques and flea markets, as I'm sure the amalgam of old things reminds me of the gardener. And I was starting to tell stories and find characters. And perhaps I was starting to create film stills, which we will see next. And talk about female identity. And here's my first serious film still moment where I caught these two young kids in Harvard Square. I'm looking at the girl and she's my main character, and she seems so self-assured on the first shot, and she's giving this boy a present. And when he opens it, you can read on the card that it says love, and her embarrassment is palpable. I showed those because they lead to a recent series called Storylines, which was influenced by my love of movies and especially foreign films. I was particularly drawn to new wave cinema and neorealist black and white cinema from the 60s in France and Italy, and especially the work of Agnes Varda, Truffaut, Fellini, and others. As I said, my parents met in Milan in the 60s and both loved movies and took us to see a lot of foreign films. This is a film still from Agnes Varda's Cleo from 5 to 7, which grapples with the subject of female identity and how women see themselves and are seen by the world. In Cleo from 5 to 7, the main character is lost and wanders around Paris, waiting to hear back from a doctor as to whether she has a terminal illness. And the film uses Paris as a visual centerpiece and a reflection of a woman's inner journey. Another director who influenced me greatly was Fellini. And here's a still from The Nights of Cabiria, one of his finest films, about a prostitute who is played by his wife, who has an exciting night with an actor who continually lets her down, but she manages to bounce back. I was drawn to these strong women characters and the glimpse the director gave us into their interior life, along with the use of European street scenes and, of course, the black and white film with all its magnificent shadows and use of light. So I began creating my own film stills by collaging images together from my archives, using street shots from Paris and Europe and photographs of women as my central characters. In these surreal images, I'm playing with the limits of reality and fiction, and the images almost always have a narrative arc. And I realized that my memories of my childhood garden, which seemed so magical and foreboding, found its way into my pictures. I use reflections, mirrors, the street, and the natural world as a backdrop to isolate these women. And light and shadow to heighten the drama in a single frame. There's always longing and searching in my work as well. Storylines explores notions of femininity and power, and there's a performative aspect to the work in the gesture and body language of this woman. She is caught in a drama, and we are uncertain of the outcome. And I also think about when you're watching a film and the scene transitions into another one, and there's an overlap, and there's a moment when you see both. And that's sort of what I'm trying to capture. Some are more surreal than others. And I'm showing our inner dialogue and how that can be reflected by the outer world. And it was in this image that I broke the proverbial third wall and showed an actual photograph that was torn. And this led me on a whole new trajectory, which you will see. So around this same time, I started painting again and using my photographs to create collages. I called this series Untethered Histories, and I'm just going to show you a few of these as well. I was very influenced by Robert Rauschenberg and later by a collage artist named Katriane de Blauer. I called it Untethered Histories as these are tiny love stories. And just as in real life, love stories sometimes go awry. I was using scraps of images, old cyanotypes, paintings, and telling stories about love and loss and heartbreak. And they're raw, and they deal with transition, interruption, breakups, and of course, longing. And I wanted to portray the messiness of love. And this led to my most recent project. During lockdown, I finally opened 2 boxes of old letters and photographs I'd sent myself from a storage unit in Chicago, where they'd been for almost 10 years. And I began combining all the letters and photographs with photographs. You'll see that in this series I called In Between Days. The work is again about memory and the impermanence of things, as well as the impermanence of the places we remember. it is also about my relationship to home and how I didn't have a traditional home growing up. But since leaving the museum, I've lived in many different places and been searching for that place called home. So I've included maps, letters, drawings, and books in these images, again, to tell stories. My work is always dialoguing with time, impermanence, and the past. And talking about female identity. And thinking about where I belong. I'm fascinated by the unconscious mind, our dreams, and also our daydreams. And that's all I'm going to show you of those. And then I'm just going to show you, we're almost perfectly on time. I'm just going to show you a very few images from this project. I'm just calling the Gardener collages. So also during lockdown, I began to really look at the images from the Gardener, and as well using old letters and photographs from my own archive and combining them. I will say that spending time in the archives was just terrific, because although I lived in the museum and I knew Mrs. Gardner's basic story, I had never really studied it or nor paid that much attention as a child, of course, to the details of her life or that of the collection. And so I just decided to go back, and I got to read my father's letters. I got to read all of his correspondence. I got to see photographs of my childhood gardens. I got to, revisit my childhood basically the last 5 years. But as I said, I'm only just going to show 1 or 2 images because this really has not been unveiled yet. So. And that is it. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah. It was great. Before we get going with the questions, we've got a couple in the chat. Once we wrap these up, feel free just to jump out there and kind of free form ask your questions. I lost them now. Nanette wanted to know, can you rename the two artists that influenced your collage work? And Rauschenberg was one, and
Rauschenberg was one, and Katrin de Blauer, who is a contemporary right now. Her work is incredible. You can see it all over the place. I can put it in the chat. It's Katrin de Blauer, Blauwer. There's lots of other collage artists I've been looking at too, but those are the two.
Okay. And Ellen, extraordinary work. Thank you so much. Can you talk a little about your process? How much is collage created in camera, shooting physical collages, and how much is composed in Photoshop?
Well, it depends which project. So Untethered Histories is pretty much straight collage almost entirely. It may have a little bit of Photoshop. In Between Days, the most recent project is a combination of the two, and so is the Gardner project. So I can't say what percentage. I shoot both. I shoot I shoot images, I shoot letters and things like that, and I work in Photoshop and I combine them together.
Okay, now we'll just open it up to the floor. Anybody else have anything?
Yeah, I have a question. Hi,
Okay.
Sarah. Thank you so much. That was great and really beautiful to learn more about you. And I love your collages. What are some of the multimedia that you use in physically making your collages?
You mean what is some of the media I use? Because
Yeah. What are the,
just saying. So, I mean, as I said, I opened this box. I mean, I use old photographs. I use old letters. I use, I mean, pretty much, anything's fair game. I use old books that I have around. I have literally like shoe boxes of things and then I use my own photographs, old cyanotypes, old photographs that I have, like parts of them that I just sort of rip up and put together. So, yeah, that's basically it. I can't really say like I have tons of stuff in my studio, and I just try to work with it. I try to pull out images that I think are going to work, but it's actually a really hard process. So I don't know when I combine them together. I'm not that savvy that I know when I take a picture it's going to work perfectly with another image. So it's a lot of trial and error. So.
and you use only your own material, like nothing?
No,
is-
I shouldn't say that at all. No. So in
Oh.
interesting days, there's some antique photographs that were not mine that I bought on eBay.
Okay.
I use most of the letters are my own, but I might have old, old books are not mine. So
Right.
it's a whole combination. And I really have to credit a Yellow Rose project, which was this project about the women getting the right to vote, and it was so they asked us to do something about it. I'd never done a historic project, and then I started this project, and I realized I never used anybody else's images. I'd never used images from the Library of Congress and things. So yeah, I just started using whatever.
Thank you.
Jess has one in the chat. Can you tell us what you shot Lost Venice on? The depth of field, soft focus nature.
Yes, I used a lens baby. That everybody always asks, but since you're all photographers, I'm just going to say that. Yeah, I used a lens baby. Other than that, it was a Canon, I don't even know, whatever the Canon 2006 model was that I had in my hand.
Okay, anybody else have anything? Bonnie Blake.
I did some post work on the Venice work as well. So yeah.
Hi, Sarah. Beautiful, beautiful. I've some work I've never seen of yours before, and it was just gorgeous. I have a question about artist practice. I have a little bit of knowledge that you must be a very busy person, and and I'm just wondering how you approach doing a project. Do you get inspired? I'm sure it's all different, but does your inspiration just sort of let you lead you to like, okay, I'm just going to do this for 3 days and nothing else? I have trouble stopping and starting and getting interrupted. And then I'm like, where was I? I'm just curious about how you integrate making your work into your life.
That's such a great question. I don't really have a great answer for you. I do find stopping and starting is hard too. I go through periods where I have long periods of time, not long periods, but I have more time. Like right now I'm in the studio probably for the next month and a half. And I don't have a whole lot on my plate other than that. I mean, obviously I have things that I have to do and work I need to get done. And then, I'm going to be away a little bit this summer. So I don't know, it does help to just continually look at it. Like I leave things open. I shouldn't on Photoshop all the time. I close my hard drives because I keep everything on external hard drives, but I leave Photoshop open a lot of times on my computer, and I leave it open for days so that when I come back, the images that I've been working with, like the 5 or 10 images that I've been looking at, are still there. But I don't have a perfect answer. I mean, in a perfect world, I would just like shut the world out, which is why going to an artist retreat is amazing, because you do shut the world out, but you're somewhere else. And I'm able to do it that way, but I think it's just really hard. I think with real life, I had a teacher in college who once said to me that brushing your teeth is going to take you away from making art. Like everything is going to conspire to stop you from making art, and you're just going to have to combat it. So I don't know what else to say. I try to combat it as hard as I can, but it's still a problem. And
Okay.
I'm gonna do a strange thing, which is turn around right now because my computer says that it's only got 12% and I'm very afraid I'm gonna lose you all. So hold on a second, let me make sure I'm plugged in. That works. Does not seem to be working.
Okay. Anybody else have anything?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Gorgeous work, Sarah, really sensitive, especially with your treatment of light and shadow. My question for you is, I see a theme of solitude. There's a real quietude throughout, but also of solitude. Is that a theme you're exploring in these projects, across projects?
Interesting. Yeah, it's funny. I do think my work has changed over time, but I do think that there is a sense of loneliness, of longing. I think that I try to explain my childhood at the Gardner as being this extraordinary magical place, but it was also a really strange place to grow up. I mean, I'm just going to say, as a 6-year-old, to live in this incredibly vast kind of cold space, that I do think, sort of wandering around. I didn't wander around the museum, of course, when it wasn't open, but still even wandering around when it was open, sometimes it wasn't full of visitors. Yeah, I'm not, it just, yeah, it's there. You're not wrong.
I have something related but unrelated. I'm sure you have seen the Netflix documentary on the Gardner.
I have.
Do you feel that's a true representation?
No.
Okay.
And since we're all friends, I'll say the thing that they never say. So there were 4 people and a dog living in the museum. And then the trustees decided that there was no longer going to be anybody in the museum except for 2 college kids.
Mm-hmm.
It was a bad choice. They also, there
Yeah.
was the carriage house, as they said, and there were actually guards that lived, there were 2 guards that lived in the carriage house, which was next to the museum. So they made a huge mistake. I'm just going to say that. And then it was horribly bungled by the FBI, which is portrayed in the movie. But yeah, yeah. And I would also say my father did not come out beautifully in that movie. And yet my father's the only person, when we first moved to the museum, you could just knock on the door and walk into the, walk in the museum at any time. You could deliver a package, anything. He was the only person who put security in the museum. So.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try one more thing because I'm starting to lose power and I'm very afraid I'm going to lose you all.
Well, we've got one more quick question. We'll let you go in case you do.
Good. I think it's working. Okay.
Pat Rose has gorgeous work. Which lens baby was used mostly for Las Vegas? Well, back then it was probably the original.
The original one. There was only one back then. So 2005, there was just one. It doesn't exist anymore. You had to squeeze it. You had to squeeze the thing in order to get it to give you the right focus. And I did use it for all of them. Some of them it's Photoshop.
Right. On that note, how did you convert to black and white? Photoshop, Silver Effects, something else?
Effects.
Silver
Yeah.
Effects, yeah.
Love Silver Effects. I still use it.
Okay, if nobody else has anything, we will wrap it up. Becky, I'll let you know.
Sarah, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Yeah, incredible work. And on the psychology of the work, especially the Venice work, the moodiness, how do you decompress after completing a project, or how does it feel to you psychologically?
I think making it into a book made it finished. I mean, I probably am somebody who could work on projects forever. Storylines is still ongoing. All the other projects you saw after that are still ongoing. I think Las Venice, one thing is I sort of stopped going to Venice. So that was, that kind of ended, although I still had all these images. But I started that project in 2006 and I probably only shot it until 2010. I only went 4 or 5 times. I already, I knew Venice, so I knew kind of what I was going for. And then it took me another 5 years to sort of sort it out, edit it, work on the images to make them what I wanted. So yeah, I decompress. When, having it made into a book was lovely. I was really, really pleased to have it be made into a book. And as I said, that sort of put a finality to it that I probably wouldn't ever put on the end of projects. So, you know, that's kind of, yeah. And as I said, I worked on a lot of projects in between. I'm not somebody who stays with one project because sort of the nature of my work, I travel and I shoot and then I come back and I work on images. So, you know, in between Venice, I was working on other projects, but I just didn't show them all.
Okay, is that it? And anybody else? In that case, we will wrap it up.
Ellen, I think, has one question.
Yeah,
Said
I
Ellen.
had a quick question. Do you also teach, or are you working just able to focus on your work your time?
I do teach. I have on my website a couple of classes that are coming up if you want to take a look. My website's really easy. It's sarahhadley.com. And I do teach a few classes.
But you're not an academic.
I'm not an academic. No.
Well, the work is extraordinary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that.
Okay,
Thank you.
Betsy, did you have something? Okay. All right. That's why we turn off our mics, the motorcycles. Next month, on the 18th of May, we have Lynn Bianchi joining us. Should be another good one. So I want to thank everybody that joined us tonight. Recording will be up tomorrow or Saturday, it should be. So if you want to revisit this.